Welcome to Bench Grinder Safety. What we want to do today is simply show some tips of how to use a bench grinder much safer, and we'll end up with the wire wheel buffer as well. But let's focus back over here to a bench grinder. I want to start with some lists, a list of don'ts, things not to do. Of course, one of the foremost ones is to avoid or not use gloves. The danger is when grinding small pieces, and of course you should use something this small, you should be using some locking pliers. We'll get to that. The danger is if you're grinding something small and you happen to get too close, the cloth will actually catch and pull you in to the stone between the tool rest and the stone, and it makes for a horrible day. You got flesh and bone and everything else. It's just not a good deal. So really, now gloves would be permissible over here on the wire wheel, because those little whiskers are flying out and your hands can maybe get a poke or two, but over here that might be different if you're far away from your work. Let's talk about locking pliers. Now, don't just use regular pliers. They've got a clamp. They've got a lock and grip. You can never hold it with a pair of channel locks or some general purpose pliers. And again, you're going to just grind something small with locking pliers. And of course, let the work, or the pliers, whichever, rest on the tool rest. The stone is turning in this direction, so it's going to push your work against the tool rest, which is much safer. Okay, so there's another tip. Okay, let's talk about where to grind and perhaps a little bit how to grind. Obviously, we'll grind on the face of the wheel. Avoid the side. And the danger is if we're grinding on the side, and if we put too much pressure on it, the wheel can crack and it might even come apart. And if this is rotating, and I believe most grinders rotate at approximately 12,000, 13,000 RPM, that's a lot of chance with that kind of force to throw some chunks of wheel. And once it starts coming apart, I guess they really come apart, coming right at you. And that would be a pleasant day. Also, if you're grinding on the face, do so not too aggressively. Meaning, don't just jam the work in there, because that's when it can catch or crack and make a force and again crack the stone and making it unsafe. And though it may not fly apart while you're using it that time, it might do so the next time it starts up. Okay. Alrighty, another thing to be cautious of, because these wheels, generally speaking, are aluminum oxide. We don't want to grind soft materials such as brass or aluminum. Now, I don't know what aluminum oxide necessarily is, but it's good hard stuff. It is our general purpose grinding wheel. There are grinding wheels made of softer stone for grinding soft materials, but they're pretty rare. I'll give you an example of what grinding of soft materials do. If you look closely, you might want to focus in here, it'll start to load up the stone, okay? I actually ground a little bit of aluminum on this stone, and it actually covered or loaded, what we call loading up the stone, and filled in all the pores. Well, now it won't cut anymore. And we'll talk about how to dress a stone later, because if that happens, and things happen, we can always get a stone dresser. And this, again, will rest on the tool rest, and we'll actually remove stone material. It's a little noisy, but it's worth it to true your stone back up and clean it off, or whatever the case is. Okay. Now, one last thing that's kind of tempting for some. After you've turned the power off, after the power's off, don't stop the stone with your work or a piece of metal or something. When things start slowing down, dynamics change. And again, something could get caught or wedged, and that's not good. Just turn the power off and let it power down all on its own. Walk away, okay? Okay, so some things to do. New list. Some things to do. The tool rest. We ought to keep this within about 1/8 of an inch. Now, in the metric terms, that would be about 3 millimeters. And this tool rest, of course, is adjustable. And if I did dress the stone, of course, I've removed material and made the stone smaller. But I can adjust it here. If I loosen that bolt there, I can tilt it. So I'm going to bring this up a little bit close. pull it back just a whisker to what I think's about the thickness of, say, about a nickel, or maybe as thin as a dime. Okay, and snug that up. That's the tool rest. A spark arrestor, sometimes they are adjustable. These are not, and this is an old enough grinder. I guess I didn't think of that or something, but the idea of a spark arrestor is the things we do grind, and some of the sparks could hit here instead of coming out at us. They'll hit here and maybe get flashed off to the side. Spark arrestor, generally, most folks would say, let's go 1/4 of an inch, which again, in the metric world, that'd be about, 6 millimeters, 5 or 6 millimeters? Okay, so there's the tool rest, the spark arrestor. We already talked about, do use locking pliers when grinding something small. As we previously pointed out, it gets hot. You're going to burn yourself. It's not safe. When you're grinding, say, a chisel, keep it cool. Just have a cup of water here, and we're going to keep it cool. Every now and then just dip it. If the edge ever gets a blue color to it, it's lost its temper, and that edge will disappear as soon as you start striking or hammering, whatever you're trying to cut. And we'll demonstrate this in just a moment. Okay. When grinding something you want to sharpen up, again, I would suggest you go this direction so the stone is going to grind towards the wire, towards your sharp edge. Not like this. I don't want to get wedged between here, for one. But number two, if you grind this direction, it actually forms on the edge out here what's called a wire burr, a wire edge. And in order to minimize that or remove that, just eliminate that whole possibility if you grind towards it and then flip it over and grind the other side. That'll make for a sharper, better edge without that little wire edge. Okay. I'm going to grind here now, and then we'll come over and we'll buff something, and I think that will take care of our grinding safety. So first and foremost, I'm going to go ahead and just turn on the power. You know, these should be bolted down, but to find a quiet place, I had to take them off and just rest them on this bench, so please don't follow my example. These should be bolted down to a bench, but I think my light demonstration here might be sufficient. So let's go ahead. We're okay here, and let's grind. See if that shiny area is where I've been grinding. I'm trying to flatten it and make it truer. We'll keep it cool. And I can grind the other side. That's looking a little better. Okay, I think you get the idea. Many chisels, it's recommended about a 60-degree taper. I don't have a little gauge with me today, but 60 allows me to get in and get underneath something a little better than, say, a 90-degree angle. Okay. Let's talk about the spark test. If you're uncertain, you found something old, you're uncertain what it's made out of, this is called the spark test. If you grind and it throws a spark, it's metal, and you can use it on these types of grinding wheels, aluminum oxide. I'm going to go ahead and just grind off. Notice my gloves are off. I'm far away. I don't need pliers on this. I'm far enough away. And I removed some of the sharp edge. I can spend more time on it. Let's say I wasn't sure what something like this really was. Go ahead and try it. There's no spark. Therefore, it fails the spark test. It must be a soft material I should not use. Now, I love brass drifts, and they get mushroomed, but don't use a grinder to take off the mushroom. Kind of figure out some other way. A mushroom on a chisel, or in this case a punch, is a good thing to keep trimmed down, because they've been known to, after they get big enough, they mushroom over enough, you're big enough, the chunk can go fly somewhere. So keep your mushroom edges groomed down. And that ought to work. Okay. Okay. We spent some time with the bench grinder. Let's talk about this little wire wheel buffer. I wish it was a little more powerful. It's a smaller one, but I do want to talk about maybe how to remove some carbon. A moment ago, we did find out this was made of steel, and I've already wire buffed it off here and removed some of the rust in case you ever wanted to find an old piece of metal and you wanted to make something work and paint it. I'm going to buff the carbon off this valve. Now, it's okay to buff carbon off of a valve so long as you stay down here in the throat, okay, in the radius area of the valve. Don't buff up here where it's really nice and shiny, because that's where the valve rides inside of its guide, up and down, right? If we scratch or make other impressions here, we could turn this into perhaps an oil consumption problem. So if you're going to buff, just buff down here and nothing more. Just get the carbon off. I'll demonstrate. Okay. I'll come out here a little bit. Even come in there and get to that. Now, notice, and that's looking quite a bit better, isn't it? I'm not done, obviously. But notice, when I was buffing, I kept the work at center or maybe slightly below. And that's recommended. Sometimes when you're trying to buff up high, the work catches and throws. So stay in the center area or slightly below. That seems to be the best position. Obviously over here, this tool rest would let you rest your work against something that's being buffed. And that's okay. Both work. Sometimes we just want a more open area and have maybe a free hand situation. Let's just do a review of what we've already talked about as far as bench grinding safety. Of course, safety glasses, I hope that's obvious. Always wear those. We talked about some don'ts in the video. Don't wear gloves. We talked about how your gloves might, if you get too close to the stone, you would get pulled in. That wouldn't be fun. Small pieces, always use locking pliers to hold those. There's no way you could hold them with a regular pair of pliers. It's just not going to work, or you're going to burn your fingers. The grinding on the side of the wheel, of course, is a don't. That's the danger or the fear here is we grind too much on the side of the wheel, it'll actually put pressure on it and crack it. Then this grinding wheel comes apart. Soft materials like aluminum or brass, we discussed how that loads up the grinding surface of the wheel, and therefore it can't grind and cut like it should. Whenever you turn the power off, just let it power down on its own. Don't use a piece of metal or something to stop the grinding wheel. That's kind of not a safe practice. And then something to add, flammables. You know, we're around a lot of brake spray and other chemicals at times. You might want to be aware of where sparks are being thrown. Let's not have a fire. Some do's, or as we mentioned, use locking pliers on small pieces. If you're going to sharpen something, keep the edge cool. Don't let the edge of your chisel or whatever you're trying to sharpen turn blue at all. It loses its temper, therefore the edge will not withstand really any kind of pounding or cutting. And of course I just simply use water to cool them off. Grind towards the edge. We pointed out how if you grind with the tool facing upward, the grinding wheel going downward will actually keep that wire edge from forming, therefore giving you a little bit better cutting edge. Spark test, that can be valuable, especially if what you're trying to grind, you don't know what material it is. If it throws a spark, it's metal. You'll be okay to use on the grinding wheel. At least on an aluminum oxide grinding wheel, it's very, very common. We mentioned the wire wheel buffer. Try to keep the work in the middle of the wheel or maybe a little below. That's just kind of a suggestion. It often works out to be most successful that way. The tool rest, back to a grinding wheel. Keep the tool rest about 1/8 of an inch away from the stone, or in the metric world, 3 millimeters. As far as the spark arrestor, which is above the stone, the thing that blocks sparks from coming around, you can probably double these figures, maybe a 1/4 inch gap for the spark arrestor, or again about 6 millimeters. And lastly, the thing we'll conclude with is the stone dresser, how to maybe unclog or grind off, wear down the stone to get down to a new set of new surface area in case it became loaded because maybe something soft was was used to grind on the wheel.